So one of my favorite systems to collect for is the Sega Saturn. I really liked the Saturn as a kid, and although the PlayStation had a greater variety of games, I think the Saturn had more interesting games. It had more unique titles, and of course it had those first-party Sega games that were just really cool, really good arcade experiences, and just really fun games. And Sega really knew how to make use of the Sega Saturn's hardware. I'm not saying the Saturn was better than the PlayStation, as better is subjective, but I probably had more fun with my Saturn than I did my PlayStation. And one of my favorite genres is of course horror games. I love horror games. And when I was doing my game room tour, I showed you guys all my games, including my Saturn stuff, but I realized I have a whole drawer of Saturn loose discs that I don't have cases for because Sega Saturn cases tend to break easily, and of course they are expensive as hell. So recently I went through these games and discovered some games that I actually forgot I had, and one of those games is an awesome horror game that nobody ever talks about. I recently got some reproduction cases for it because I want to take care of this game. It's a pretty pricey one, about $100 now, but it's so good, it's so cool, and there's really nothing like it that I wanted to be able to preserve this. So today we're going to do a review on Enemy Zero for the Sega Saturn. So what is Enemy Zero? Let's find out. Enemy Zero is probably one of the most unique and interesting horror games ever, and it being on the Sega Saturn in the first place is part of that interesting story. Enemy Zero was developed by Warp, who was the team responsible for the game D, which released on a variety of platforms, including the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. D styled itself after the point-and-click game Myst, but had a strong emphasis on horror-themed elements within the puzzles of the game. Enemy Zero was originally going to be a PlayStation title, but due to the fact that Sony didn't meet demand for pre-orders of D, the head of Warp, Kenji Eno, did one of the boldest things ever in gaming. At a Sony press conference, Eno showed off Enemy Zero. As the trailer ended, a Sony PlayStation logo appeared on screen and quickly phased out and morphed into a Sega Saturn logo. The balls on this guy. If you have played D before, the lead character Laura should look familiar right away. D, D2, and Enemy Zero all share the same lead character, but think of her as a digital actress as none of the stories ever intertwine or relate to each other. Laura awakens abruptly from a cryogenic sleep aboard the spaceship called Aki, and due to the abruptness of her awakening suffers from some memory issues. She quickly realizes something is very wrong aboard the Aki, and after contacting other members on the ship to check out their statuses and meet up with them, we start our adventure in Enemy Zero. Enemy Zero obviously takes inspiration from the aforementioned D, but expands upon the gameplay as the core gameplay elements are broken up into two different segments. When you start the game, you start in a room, and notice that it has a point-and-click-like interface with interactions with things in the room. You can move around in terms of checking your surroundings and looking at different things within the room, but you are still restricted in terms of freely walking, much like in Myst or D. Puzzle solving is also a huge emphasis in these parts, whether it be to open doors or other restricted areas, or gaining access to needed items to advance. What sets this game apart from Myst and D though, is when you leave a room. This being a spaceship, there's a lot of terrain to cover when moving from area to area. You do this by walking forwards or backwards in a first-person 3D view of your character. You quickly realize you aren't alone on this ship though, which is where the combat comes into play, and the real fear begins. The Aki spaceship has been overrun with some alien-type enemies, but there's a catch. They are invisible and you cannot see them. At the start of the game, you don't even have a weapon, and once you get one, it's pretty limited with a single shot and a long recharge time. So how do you decipher where an enemy is then? By sound. A pinging noise alerts you to the distance of the enemy. As the pinging gets faster and more frantic, the enemy alien is coming closer to you. Once you get the gun, you have a brief moment to shoot the enemy, but if you shoot too fast or too slow, you'll get killed, resulting in an instant game over. Since your gun needs a recharge, it really adds a stealth element to the game in which you try and avoid these alien enemies. On paper, an invisible enemy sounds like the least scariest kind of enemy, but once you're playing the game and you dim the lights, true fear and panic is exposed as you try and stay alive. The game is a lengthy quest as well, with a lot of cutscenes and voice acting, which for the time is pretty solid. Cutscenes are often really gruesome, and although the character models themselves are pretty dated by today's standards, the game's presentation was top notch when it was released back in 1997. The game is also pretty long, spanning 4 discs, making it one of the only Sega Saturn games to date to be this large. The story of Laura and the other crew members is pretty interesting, with many layers of depth, and even the cheap deaths from invisible aliens won't stop you from wanting to uncover all of the secrets of Enemy Zero.
You know, my husband Parker kept this little blue canary in his room on Earth. Imagine a guy with his face cuddling a canary. Pretty funny, huh? Whenever he woke up in the morning, the first thing he always did was stand in front of the bird cage by the window and feed his bird. With those massive hulking hands of his, he would gently give it food. When we got this mission, he was so upset over being separated from his bird. He broke down and cried. You would never think he was like that, huh? We ended up taking the bird outdoors and letting him go, but Parker had regrets. He said that maybe we had let go of our little blue bird of happiness. Hey, let's drop it. I shouldn't go on like this. Parker wouldn't. So it's you. You killed him, didn't you? Where?
So like I said, Enemy Zero is a really unique experience on the Sega Saturn, and I really don't think there's ever been another game quite like it, just because of the way it blends the genres. It has that point and click style gameplay, and then all of a sudden you're thrust into almost a first person shooter with limited ammo style. And because of that, it makes the game really scary. When you're in those corridors and that dinging is just din 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 din, like it freaks the hell out of you because you don't know where the enemy is. And that's what makes Enemy Zero so timeless to me. Just that scare factor, because you could look at old polygon creatures and maybe get scared by them if they're gruesome or something, but sound is something that is just timeless. Sound is something that can always be scary, no matter how old you are, no matter how old the setting is. And that's why Enemy Zero really holds up for me today, and is a great game for Sega Saturn owners. If you don't own the game on the Sega Saturn, maybe track down a disc-only copy. Like I said, it's pretty expensive, around $100, but I definitely think it's a game worth playing on the Sega Saturn. Hope you guys enjoyed this review. As always, if you liked it, be sure to hit a like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, leave me a comment down below, check out other videos on the channel, make sure you subscribe, and if you really like my face, check out my Patreon page. I'll catch you guys next time. Later.